April 19th, 2021, Fairfax, Virginia. My dear audience, as you most certainly already know, my name is Troiano, and this is a lecture recital titled Expanding the Early American Brass Band Repertoire. This presentation accompanies my dissertation, which is titled From Antiquity to Academia, a history of early American brass bands and a way forward for their adaptation within institutions of higher learning. The song you are currently listening to is a beautiful piece of music that has the power to bring audiences to tears. It can entice listeners to reminisce about their past and remember far-off memories. And it can somehow conjure mental images of grassy fields and rolling pastures with its sweet, folk-like melody. Ashokan Farewell for many reminds them of the American Civil War, a war which was fought between the years of 1861 and 1865. This connection is made primarily because it served as the main theme song for Ken Burns' 1990 documentary miniseries, The Civil War. This piece of music, however, was not written during the Civil War. It was instead written in 1982 by musician Jay Ungar, and was inspired by the sorrow and loss he felt when saying goodbye to his annual summer camp in New York. Does this make the connection many associate with Ashokan Farewell and the Civil War incorrect? What music is appropriate for it to be an authentic performance? How does this concept apply to the repertoire of Civil War reenactment brass bands and other early American brass bands? Throughout this lecture recital, we will explore these questions by examining different pieces of music from different sources and by contextualizing them through different lenses of authentic performance. In regard to this piece, Ashokan Farewell, I believe that the connection it has developed over time to the Civil War makes it appropriate to perform in certain situations as a part of the Civil War repertoire, despite its lack of historical authenticity. The connection and sentimentality it conjures is akin to period ballads sung during the war, making this piece spiritually appropriate, or as we will later discuss, what I call aesthetically authentic. I hope you enjoy the rest of the performance. Sincerely yours, Troiano. The term early American brass band is one I have coined that represents musical ensembles both in the present and in the past who perform musical selections and styles from the time of the American brass band movement. The American brass band movement refers to a period of time between 1835 and 1892, when brass bands were one of the dominant forms of musical entertainment and service in the United States. 1835 is the starting point for this movement because it was the year the first all brass bands were formed in America, centering in New England and New York. I chose 1892 as an ending year for the movement because it marks the death of famed band leader Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore, as well as marks the formation and beginning of John Philip Sousa's professional civilian concert band. This ending year can be debated, however, since many brass bands continued to perform well into the 20th century and mixed instrumentation concert bands were popular well before 1892. Although most early American brass bands exist today as Civil War style brass bands, the term is intended to include pre- and post-Civil War bands as well, including brass bands in the American West during the Gold Rush era and family brass troops and more. Keeping in mind that early American brass bands can refer to both historical and contemporary groups, the qualifier early American is intended to differentiate the ensemble type from other brass bands such as New Orleans brass bands and British brass bands. British-style brass bands are becoming increasingly popular in the United States, especially at colleges and universities, and contain 28 musicians performing music designed to facilitate competition between other British-style brass bands. Simply referring to a group as a brass band or American brass band would likely result in people envisioning a British-style brass band in the United States, such as the James Madison University Brass Band or the Brass Band of Battle Creek. Although early American brass bands consist primarily of brass and percussion instruments, there are occasionally flutes and clarinets in these ensembles as well, especially in those that existed towards the end of the brass band period. Symphonic brass ensembles and brass quintets may occasionally perform music from the American brass band movement, but their ensemble tradition is firmly rooted in the orchestral tradition rather than the band tradition. Salvation Army brass bands were in the United States by 1880, but their repertoire and instrumentation is more closely related to British brass bands as well. Brass bands of the 19th century initially evolved from town militia bands and were utilized extensively throughout the Civil War as entertainment for both soldiers and civilians. Today, early American brass bands exist primarily as reenactment brass bands complete with Civil War period instruments and uniforms, though some have chosen to perform with either a post-war impression, civilian town band impression, or in modern concert attire with no visual historical impression at all. The 8th Green Machine Regiment Band is demonstrating each of these possibilities here today. As you can see, half of the band is wearing 19th century military uniforms, a style that can be worn by reenactment Civil War brass bands. Our band elects to wear green as a way to align itself with the George Mason University school colors, similar to how bands during the 1860s would wear uniforms to reflect the regiment that they were attached to. Though not worn by a historical band specifically, these green uniforms were worn by the 1st and 2nd United States sharpshooters and used as an early form of camouflage during the Civil War. This is another example of what I mentioned earlier as being aesthetically authentic, meaning likely intentions of this period are being adapted to a contemporary environment. Moving along, you can see that myself and a number of the members of the band are wearing what we could call a town band or civilian band impression. My clothing, complete with a hand-sewn coat, vest, shirt, and trousers, could be considered more accurate or authentic to the period, while the modern tuxedos with period hats and ties worn by my colleagues is another viable option for civilian bands as well, especially those who are still growing or early in their formation. Our conductor, Stephen Canastracey, is wearing all black to demonstrate a contemporary non-impression. Groups such as the Americas Brass Band, Chestnut Brass Company, and Saxton's Cornet Band now perform in this all-black attire. Stephen is also conducting the group with a 19th century reproduction conductor's baton made of rosewood by Garmin Bowers. In regard to the selections of repertoire specifically, many bands choose to only perform period band arrangements read from copies of the original band books. We know that these are exact arrangements played by bands of the period and can be viewed as the most authentic repertoire that can be performed today. We will now perform one such piece that was published in 1853 as part of G.W.E. Friedrich's Brass Band Journal. Old Dog Tray will be performed in its entirety and demonstrate the practice of an early American brass band performing a period band arrangement as it was published on period instruments of the time. This music was found in the Library of Congress website and is available to everyone for free. Enjoy. Many bands have the ultimate goal of performing on historical 19th century brass instruments, but some perform on reproductions or modern instruments depending on their budget and accessibility to period horns. Period instruments are quite rare and therefore relatively expensive. Many bands choose to perform on modern instruments for these reasons. And if you want to view this decision from an aesthetically authentic perspective, we can say that in the 19th century, bands were playing on the best instruments at that time. Playing on modern instruments today is playing on the best instruments available in the 21st century. We will primarily perform on authentic and reproduction period instruments for this recital, but will now switch to the modern counterparts of our instruments to demonstrate the timbral differences between period instruments and modern instruments. Modern instruments are obviously more common and comparatively easier to acquire than period instruments. For example, the E-flat alto horns we will use are instruments that are utilized in British-style brass bands. The E-flat trumpet is an instrument that can be owned by freelance musicians or college students. Both of these instruments are more easily obtainable than period instruments and offer bands the opportunity to perform 19th century brass band repertoire without needing to transpose the music or sacrifice the voicing. If a school has a British-style brass band, many of the instruments found in that ensemble can be used to play 19th century American brass band repertoire. This exact formation was used by Gil Klein at Humboldt State University with the British-style Humboldt Bay Brass Band, doubling as the early American-style Fort Humboldt Brass Band. Please enjoy this excerpt of the period band arrangement of Old Dog Tray being played on modern instruments. If musicians don't have the modern counterparts to the period brass instruments commonly used by early American brass bands, such as E-flat altos and E-flat trumpets or cornets, they may use the most common brass instruments found in the American concert band and traditional brass quintets. This upcoming arrangement of Old Dog Tray was written by Randy Cabell and is transposed down a perfect fourth to allow for B-flat trumpets to play the highest soprano voice comfortably. Mr. Cabell also provides substitute parts for B-flat trumpet and horn in F. You will notice that this excerpt is performed on two B-flat trumpets, horn in F, trombone, and tuba, or also known as a traditional brass quintet found in most music programs. Enjoy. In band historian Dr. Philippa Burgess's research of 30 19th century brass band concert programs, she noticed that 55% of them contained vocal soloists with brass band accompanying, and 40% of them contained brass solos performed by band members in front of the band. Brass bands would frequently feature their most accomplished musicians as soloists, which would usually be the lead E-flat soprano players. Most formally trained brass musicians during the 19th century learned cornet, while the other instruments were picked up by amateurs and learned on the job. However, there are instances of other strong players and instrumentalists being featured in concerts at the time as well. I will now perform one such piece. This arrangement of air from Mozart's The Magic Flute was published in the mid-19th century for brass band and baritone soloist. We are once again using our period instruments and reading the music off of the original score published in the 1870s. Enjoy. Many popular parlor songs of the time, particularly ballads, were arranged for brass bands in the 19th century. Again, referencing Dr. Burgess's research, 95% of the brass band programs she surveyed contained arrangements of at least one sentimental ballad. However, not all popular ballads from the period have band arrangements that have survived to today. One of these examples is The Vacant Chair by George F. Root. Since this piece was written in 1862 and was popular among soldiers and civilians during the period, it is often regarded as being authentic when brass bands perform this piece, despite not having a surviving 19th century brass band arrangement. Allowing modern arrangers to create new arrangements of period songs that do not have period band arrangements opens a significant amount of potential repertoire. This approach blends the concepts of historical authenticity and aesthetic authenticity because the music is of the period and likely was played by brass bands at the time, but modern arrangements must be constructed to be able to experience the music in that original way. To hear one such project, here is Federal City Brass Band leader Jari Villanueva's period-appropriate contemporary arrangement of George F. Root's 1862 ballad, The Vacant Chair. Home Sweet Home was a very popular song during the American Civil War, and there are surviving 19th century brass band arrangements of this tune. In 1878, John Hartman wrote a theme and variations for solo cornet in A with piano accompaniment based on the popular ballad Home Sweet Home. John Hartman was a Prussian composer and brass bandsman during the 19th century who wrote countless brass band arrangements, as well as brass solos with piano accompaniment. Knowing that Hartman played in brass bands as a cornetist and wrote for brass bands, it is possible that a brass band arrangement of this theme and variations for cornet and piano existed in the late 1800s. I will now perform an arrangement that I made of his variations on Home Sweet Home, which I orchestrated for an early American brass band. I used the original piano score to orchestrate the piece in a period style, but I elected to transpose the piece up to E flat major from the original key of D major to maintain the fingering pattern originally intended for cornet in A. As we did with the Vacant chair, orchestrating brass solos with piano by notable band composers for brass bands would expand the possible repertoire significantly. Enjoy. Was performing a contemporary arrangement of variations on Home Sweet Home written in 1878 by a brass composer much different from playing the vacant chair? Both pieces originated in the 19th century and were arranged in the 21st century for early American brass bands to perform. Both pieces are authentic, but at the same time the arrangements are not. As you can see, authenticity exists on a spectrum, and yet it can also never be truly achieved. By making informed decisions and having reasonable intent, the possibilities of how to give an authentic performance expands and can give audiences and performers a new and unique perspective, perhaps even more so than a band that restricts itself to only one source of repertoire. Before the age of recorded music, families would listen to live music, brass bands, quadrille orchestras, minstrel bands, operas, family singers, etc. But if they enjoyed a piece and wanted to continue to hear it at home, they were out of luck. That is, if a piano reduction of the piece didn't exist. Many composers, arrangers, and publishers produced piano reductions of popular ensemble pieces so that they could be performed and enjoyed at home in the family parlor. Many of those piano reductions still exist and can be orchestrated for early American brass bands adhering to period arrangement techniques. We will now perform one of those re-orchestrations I made for you now. The original heading of this piano reduction read, "As performed with unbounded applause by E. Kendall at the Boston Brass Band's concert." This piece was performed by Ned Kendall on keyed bugle in the 1830s in front of brass bands, but an arrangement won't appear in original 19th century band books. Is this brass band music doomed to remain trapped as a piano piece? Not today. Enjoy Bugle Waltz. I believe that there is a place for both areas of authenticity, both historical and aesthetic, and one is not better or more correct than the other. Much like the spectrum of authenticity, bands will often move fluidly between being historically authentic and aesthetically authentic. This is, again, because achieving true authenticity is impossible as 21st century beings. We can get close, and we can learn a lot from trying, but we must never forget that contemporary brass bands performing 19th century music are not just reflections of the past, but tools of the present that can help us understand our own American band tradition and help shape its future. Is there a place for newly composed music in early American brass band performances? I would argue that newly composed music in a period style is a form of being aesthetically authentic. You as a listener have already heard that many of the selections that we performed so far were written in the 19th century, but many were arrangements that were written much more recently. These arrangements blur the line between period music and new music, historically authentic and aesthetically authentic. It is generally regarded that as long as the aesthetic of an early American brass band repertoire is maintained and that it has an anchor in the 19th century, it is acceptable. But what about original compositions inspired by the time period, style, and aesthetic? We know that in college music theory classes, students are taught to compose original chorales and fugues in the style of Johann Sebastian Bach. So what if students were taught to write quicksteps or waltzes in the style of Claudio Grafula or ballads in the style of George Frederick Root? What if those traditional styles are mixed with a contemporary compositional voice? One of the pieces we will use to demonstrate this new repertoire area is Butler's Blunders. Butler's Blunders was written in 2019 by Mason alumnus Anthony O'Toole and was updated for the 8th Green Machine Regiment Band in 2021. In this piece, O'Toole mixes his love for history and his own unique compositional style. See if you can hear the nods to both musical periods in this premiere performance of Anthony O'Toole's Butler's Blunders. We at last come to the end of the program. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, which is a culmination of years of research and music making here at George Mason University. Thank you to Stephen Canestraci and the members of the 8th Green Machine Regiment Band for collaborating with me for this lecture recital, and to Josh and the Green Machine Media and Hilton Performing Arts Center staff for helping me capture it. Thank you to my friends within the field of the early American brass band, B.J. Pino, Jari Villanueva, Michael O'Connor, Mark Elrod, Sam Loudenslager, and so many more. I'm sorry I can't name everyone. I want to thank my euphonium professor, Dr. Mark Jenkins, for all of his knowledge, guidance, and patience the last 6 years. Thank you to Dr. Michael Nickens for all of your support with my research, the regiment band, and for your encouragement to expand my horizons. To my wife and family, thank you for the love and support through the many degrees and all the nerdy brass stuff. This final piece was arranged by Mason alumnus Andrew Velez, specifically for closing out this recital. Throughout the American brass band movement, it was common to arrange popular songs of the day for brass band. Some sentimental tunes would get a style upgrade in the process, such as when the tune, Dear Mother, I've Come Home to Die, became Dear Mother, I've Come Home to Die Quickstep. Much like marching bands and pep bands today, brass bands in the 19th century knew what the people expected to hear and were sure to entertain them with the latest songs and medleys of the day. What better way to follow that spirit and idea than to arrange a popular song of today for early American brass band? I think many of you will recognize this 2014 hit by Sia, though with the vintage twist a la postmodern jukebox. Thank you again for tuning in, and enjoy our version of Chandelier. Thank you.